and have always been brought up among a large number of kin. But this idea that of a family in which the children never grow up. You may have noticed that all our houses are planned for the children not to grow up. There is no place for adolescents in a modern house at all. That's the reason we have so much trouble with them, and why mothers work so hard to throw them out, because there isn't any room in the kitchen. We never have a kitchen nowadays in which it's safe to leave two women, because they bump into each other so frightfully. And this kind of family, in which the ties are broken between the young couple and their parents, and there are no relatives anywhere nearby, and there are no neighbors that you know, and each young couple goes out and finds a home of their own. This is a very new style. It's a style that we get whenever we get immigration, for one thing. The best kind of immigrants to go from one country to another are young people who don't have any children on the whole, make the best daring immigrants. If a man can persuade a girl to leave her family and her friends and go overseas to a new way of life, the two of them make a very good pair of immigrants. And if they have to be pioneers in a strange country, and if we settle the moon, I suppose that's the sort of people we'll do it with. Explorers who are going a long way off, you don't send women. You only send men because you want the men to come back. And one of the best ways of getting men to come back is to not send no women. But if you want the men to come back, if you want them to stay, if you want them to come back, you send no women. If you want them to stay, you send the women along in proper numbers so that they can set up a colony. And for the last 150 years, people have been moving from the country to the city, from one country to another, all over the world. And these tiny families have been the ones that moved on the whole. So we've come to think that this is the way, this is the family, just a husband and wife and some children. But of course it hasn't been through history. And we're beginning to see that this is a pretty fragile form of family, and that to have no one for either parent to depend on, and some children, whether the wife works as well as the husband, that doubles making it more difficult. Then, because if the children get sick, what do you do? And the Swedes have passed a law now saying men can stay home when their children are sick, which is a big help, I suppose, but it doesn't improve anything very much to keep the men home as well as the women. And it doesn't change the fact that these families are too isolated and too alone and have too little to depend on. So that when people say that our families are going to pieces today, that we have so many divorces, as we do, have a very large number, and blame women's lib for it too. I've never seen a good marriage that was broken up by women's lib, but it's a very good excuse for breaking up a bad one. When we look at and say the family's in danger, the family isn't in danger, but a lot of families are in danger. A lot of families, people married too young, they went from one home into another without ever learning any kind of independence, and they become very dependent on each other, and then if it doesn't work, they behave like spoiled children and walk out at the first quarrel. And we now have something like 9 million households headed by women in this country, which is not a good state at all, because really every household that contains children needs 2 adults, some sex, but 2. One is not enough to deal with small children and all the emergencies that go with small children. Now, I'm not talking about people who like to live alone with a cat, so, or a dog, but even there, it's really very risky. You live alone, you're a middle-aged person, and you fall down and crack your head, and you aren't found for 3 days because nobody knows, nobody's there to wonder when you came home at night, and your cat doesn't get fed. Worrying. And a great deal of our talk at present about all the roles between men and women have this same very temporary character as our picture of the present day marriages are concerned. When there were 11 Episcopal women who got themselves illegally ordained in Philadelphia, the press talked as if nothing like this had ever happened in the history of the human race. And we had women preachers defying somebody way back as early as the 17th century. They've been doing it often and having trouble with somebody, Methodists or Presbyterians or somebody. And it isn't such an unprecedented event as we think of. So one of the important things is to get over the panic. You know, what's going to happen? The whole of the marriage system is going to fall to pieces because the husband takes out the garbage. Now, the garbage is a very, very tricky point. And it's a very interesting point. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why the garbage was the central point of quarreling in any family with a little woman's liberation in it. And it's because, you see, the outdoors belongs to men. And the outdoors has always belonged to men. Now, what you define as the outdoors differs. Sometimes women have all the chickens, and sometimes they had the pig pen, and sometimes they had a large garden. But then beyond that was something that belonged to men. So you can extend the house into the garden if you want to. But chasing elephants belonged to men. Always has. And because women couldn't really chase elephants with a baby on their hip. And so before bottle feeding was invented, women didn't go chasing elephants. Now, occasionally they do now, of course, in motor cars. And so that everything at a distance belonged to men, and everything where the fastest way you could move belonged to men. Now, the fastest way you could move mightn't be very fast. You know, it might have a dog sled or a donkey, but the fastest form of locomotion belonged to men always. And as you got a faster form, they relinquished the earlier one. You see, horses used to belong to men. Now it's only little girls that take riding lessons all over the place. It's a very feminine activity, and then they will go to bed in their spurs at one period. But when there were only horses, horses belonged to men. When we got motor cars, the men were willing to let women ride horses. When we got airplanes, they were willing to let women drive motor cars. And when we got astronauts, they're willing to have women as pilots. See, so there isn't any inability of women to do any of these things, but there's a general tendency for men to prefer to keep for themselves the faster form of locomotion and the more distant trip. And that we find everywhere in the world. We don't know whether we'll always find it or not. If fathers take more of a role in bringing up boys, maybe we won't. But at present, everywhere in the world, children are majorly brought up by women, regardless of their sex. And so boys have to learn that they're not women, and girls have to learn how to be women. And mothers push those boys off their laps everywhere in the world and say, get on with it. Get out there. And whether they're supposed to be fighters or hunters or politicians, whatever they're supposed to be, mothers have to teach little boys that this is what you have to do. Get off my lap and get going. Occurs everywhere in the world. Now, we don't know for sure whether this is because as men can't have babies, they have to do other things. And in some parts of the world, it looks as if they were just making up for the fact they couldn't have babies. In the part of the world that I work in New Guinea, all the ceremonies are ceremonies in which the men pretend the children were really theirs. And they build great big houses, men's houses that women aren't allowed to enter, and enormous bark tunnels, and they take the little boys and they crawl all the way through the tunnel, which gets called the womb, and come out at the other end, and the men say, now we had them. You see, the women just thought they did. And we have versions of this happening now, of course, with people who want test tube babies. Because if we had test tube babies, you could reduce the role of the female to as short a period as the role of the male. And you put the fertilized embryo in a test tube. And somebody has to, keep the temperature constant, but like an aquarium with electric attachments. So but Father could have it on his desk. And this has been one of the daydreams right around the world. And men have always had a secret suspicion that women might be able to have children without them. And it's always worried them. And of course, paternity has always been disputable. And one of the things that we can say about the history of the human race, there are a lot of arguments at present as whether women are inventors or not. Did they invent agriculture? Well, the chances are they did, because they were the gatherers of seeds and roots and nuts and bulbs, and it's more likely that they were the ones that noticed that if the seeds fell on the ground, they came up, and it occurred to them, you better put some seeds there, and you'd have them come up where you wanted. But we're not sure. It might have been some man who had nothing else to do watching women plant the seeds who got the idea. You can't tell. And men do a lot of sitting around in very simple societies. And this was undoubtedly discovered in a very simple society. But there's one thing that were certain women discovered, and that is the paternity of men, because they were the only people that were in a position to do it. But we know that for probably 1 million years, paternity wasn't understood. And so a man attached himself to a woman, or attached a woman to him, however you want to phrase it, and took the children along with them, but without any sense they were his children. And of course, when he discovered they were his children, that was very exciting. And we invent all sorts of ideas about property and names and legitimacy immediately came up that hadn't been there before. And also, if we look back, and to understand what's happening today, the anthropologist's job is to look back 1 million years. We don't have too much data, but we have some. And say how were people living a long, long time ago? How were they living before they became people, as we know them? What happened? And we find some very odd things. For one thing, women were never given weapons in any society for any length of time in the whole of human history. Now, it isn't that men are unwilling to have women work. They give them digging sticks and rolling pins and brooms. Brooms have belonged to women since the beginning of time, and all sorts of long objects with which they have to do useful labor, but not weapons. Weapons have been reserved for men in a very few moments in human history. Very, very occasionally, a society has armed women briefly, and they've always got over it very fast. We don't know whether the societies that armed women aren't here anymore, or whether there's been some kind of basic feeling in the whole of human society that they should not arm women. Now, this may be because women give life, and a general sense that the people who are entrusted with giving life shouldn't be the people who dish out death. That may be the point. But whatever the point is, it's been true universally. And hunting belonged to men. Now, fishing very often belongs to women. You just go around, scoop them up with a net, and that isn't a very aggressive activity. But right through the whole of human history, hunting has been male, and all the weapons, when you invented a club, was the first thing that human beings invented, probably. And then the bow and arrow, which was a magnificent thing, because then, for the first time, a small little creature, which is what human beings are as compared with lions and tigers and mastodons, was able to kill these great big animals. And being able to destroy at a distance made the early man able to cope with all these dangers around him. And we have the same thing in this country today, where our notion of a gun is that it makes a little man, little good man, equal to a big bad man. And again, it's something where you can destroy at a distance and you don't depend on your muscle. So right through human history, animals have belonged to men. First they hunted them, then they tamed them, then they herded them, and today they won't let women be veterinarians. You know, it's the same general point. They let women be doctors today, but not veterinarians. That's unwomanly now. And you can try to figure out why it's more unwomanly to treat a kitten than it is to treat a bulky basketball player. But, and through history we've had two strands going on always. Men with animals and more animals, and women gardening and raising gardening food. And then the plow was invented. Now, when the plow was invented, men promptly took it over, because if you're going to have an animal in the picture, that belonged to men. And so with plow culture, men became farmers. Up to that point, they used to, well, they clear the brush and cut down a few trees if the trees needed cutting down, and then they came in at the harvest and piled up the food and boasted about it. But the women did all the work in between, as long as there were no animals involved. But the minute you got the plow, then the men's animals had got into the woman's field, and we had farmers, and men were pinned down as they had never been pinned down in history. Because taking care of animals is very boring. You have to feed them twice a day, or you have to take them out to pastures and graze. And when we put men on the farm, they started trying to get off it. And they've been trying to get off it ever since. So that more and more men have leave the farm every year, and civilization may be said to have grown out of men trying to get off the farm. And also, you could produce much more food with the plow, so you could free some men to be generals and soldiers and statesmen and poets and priests and all sorts of things. A few men got freed from everyday work, from day in and day out doing the things that were mere subsistence. But most men didn't. And when we talk here today about how dull woman's work is, and how day after day after day she does the same thing, you have to realize how dull most men's work is. And day after day after day, they do the same thing all their lives, just to be parents. And in most parts of the world, just to get enough food for the next day. And in about over a third of the world, they don't even get enough food for the next day, if men and women both work. So this picture of the emancipated male, who's doing all these fascinating, interesting things, being president or governor or something, has to be measured against the fact that most males, like most females, throughout human history have spent their entire lives just bringing up the next generation. That was all. Just replicating themselves and dying. And working terribly, terribly hard. I remember during World War II, there was a very bad mine disaster in which some miners were trapped in a mine for several days, and they were trying to get to them. And when they got to them, they were dead. But they found the letters they'd written their wives. There were a whole series of them, giving their wives advice about how to take care of the children, telling them where there was a little money somewhere, or where someone could help them. At the very last breath that they were drawing in this horrible, trapped in a mine, thinking about their wives and children. So the picture of the housebound woman has to be complemented by the picture of the job-bound man in our society, or the man who, once agriculture was invented, who spent his days as a very, very hard-working farmer all over the world. But there are other consequences, too, of animals belonging to men, because when men had great herds of animals, they began breeding animals. Now, in the parts of the world where the women do all the gardening and there are no animals to speak of that amount to much, people are very much impressed with the fact that it's women who have babies. And you get all sorts of fertility cults that are tied up with women. And women tend to be goddesses of fertility and things of this sort. But when you have a lot of animals, you're awfully impressed with bulls and boars and the male who is capable of having 1,000 children. I mean, compared women only have 5 or 6 usually, or 10. The largest number of children a female has ever had is 65 that's ever been, and they were mostly triplets produced. So as compared with what a really up-and-coming stud animal is able to produce, you get very impressed with masculinity. And in some parts of the world, you have an enormous emphasis on what men can do. Men can hunt. Men are very, very important, and the whole society is built around what men can do, with women doing a lot of the same things, but they're male things. In the tropical agriculture, where women did all the work and you didn't have the plow, everybody's impressed with what women can do. And this has gone on right through history, and it's possible that it's going to continue to go on as we substitute machines for animals. Because you see, what happens is that where 2 generations ago on a farm you had teams of horses, now you have reapers and binders and cultivators, and everything is mechanized. And it all belongs to the men and not to women. And so in some places now we introduce machines where there never been oxen or horses or any draft animal at all. The minute you introduce the machine, they push women out of the fields and turn them into consumers. And of course that is quite disastrous, because having nothing else to do, they have more children. And this is what happened in the 1950s. We sent women out to the suburbs to be consumers and to do absolutely nothing that was creative, so they had children by the dozen promptly. I mean, what else do you do? You live in the suburb and have to do your own housework, and you're too far from anywhere, and, well, have 1 child, you might as well have 2, might as well have 3, might as well have 4, might as well have 5. And that's what happened in the 1950s. This country went mad about having children. Station wagons full of them. And the minute you give women something else to do, whether it's working in the fields or working somewhere else where they're part of the productive process, they aren't anxious to have so many children, because children interfere with the work that they're doing. But the children don't interfere with keeping house with a lot of electric gadgets particularly. You can tie them down, put them in playpens, keep them there. So we've seen this happening too, over and over again. As cities were built and you brought women into the cities, and they no longer worked in the fields, and they no longer contributed to the food in any way, and they bought it in the market, and then you tend to get your housebound woman who only operates in maintenance, now, which is very dull. And it's, at the end of a week for a modern American woman who is living at home with a family to look after, at the end of the week she says, well, I got through it. Nothing happened, thank God. Nobody broke a bone. The roof didn't fall in. There wasn't a fire. Wonderful. Got through the week. Nothing to show for it except that nothing happened, which isn't invigorating at all. And of course, men who work in a repetitive task that has very little interest in it feel very much the same way. There wasn't an accident. They weren't laid off. There wasn't a strike. They're still employed. They got through that week and kept their seniority, which is very often all they've got. If they're working in a plant, just as all a woman has got is that she's got a husband who hopefully will support her the rest of her life. So that these have all happened over and over again in human history. At the same time, of course, life has gotten larger scale. People have moved around further and further. The machines have gotten faster. The supermarkets have gotten bigger. But nevertheless, these are all parts of a long time process of relations between men and women. And there's the only constants that one can find in every society are that whatever men do is more important than what women do. Doesn't make any difference what it is. If men make pots, making pots is important. If women make it, it's just something near the home. And I worked in one society where they spent a lot of time dressing dolls substantially, and taking men's hair and curling it and putting curls on the dolls. But that was men's work. It was very important, very significant. And so that whatever men do has been achievement, whatever women have done is just part of everyday life. And all the great mobility, all the emphasis on distance and strength and speed have gone to men as compared with women. And this has been constant in every society. Now, we've had quite a few other things that have happened and that are relevant to a college like this, where you have quite a lot of vocational courses, where you have one of the, or I don't know whether it's the only one, but anyway, you have a school of nursing here that's known throughout the state, and you have various kinds of technical courses. And we've had a long history of women occasionally getting a vocation that was different from being a homemaker, and then that vocation getting so powerful that men take it away from them. And nursing is a very good example. In early Christianity, where Roman laws were still holding in Rome, there were lots of rich widows. There must have been as many rich widows then as there are now, but they were more useful. And following the dictates of early Christianity about caring for the sick and the lame and the halt and the blind, these rich widows turned their homes into hospitals. And for the first time in human history, you had gently bred, aristocratic women nursing the people off the streets, beggars, the lowest, the sickest, and very often the most evil characters. They went out and got them and brought them in and nursed them. And there was a religious order of widows, and they got too independent. So the church abolished them. Just abolished them like that, and invented nuns, you know, so that they'd be able to keep in order, in an order. So, and they decreed that the nuns were to nurse women and the brothers were to nurse men. And that went on for a while, and then the brothers got tired of nursing men, so they invented the idea that nuns could nurse men. And as long as they were nuns. You know, that's where the cap came from. The nurse's cap is a descendant of the fact that you show you're a good woman by some kind of garb. And if you're a really good woman, you can nurse anybody and keep your virtue. And, well, so then after a while, the nuns were nursing everybody, and then you got mother superiors. You see, the trouble is that whenever you have a female profession, pretty soon you get some pretty outstanding women in it. And they're allowed to boss other women. And men don't notice that, and they don't mind. And if they've enough women to boss, they become pretty tough characters. Head nurses, everybody knows what they're like in a hospital. So when the nuns had control of the hospitals and the mother superior had jolly well had control of the hospitals, then you again got a rebellion, this time from the male physicians. They got into quarrels in Paris over what to feed the patients. And the mother superior said she knew, and the doctor said they knew, and they threw all the nuns out again. And there were a couple of centuries where you only had prostitutes in hospitals. And then Florence Nightingale reinvented the idea that a good woman could nurse anybody. And it's a great invention. You know, it's one of the great inventions, the idea that under a particular sanction, women could nurse the roughest characters, and this was a good thing to do. Well, we're getting another period now, of course. Then nursing was invented, our kind of nursing, which was reinvented really by Florence Nightingale in the war. And then we got head nurses again, and all the young doctors had a horrible time Well, the head nurse told them what to do when they were young, and they waited. They thought, just wait till I get fully established and I'll fix her, which they've been doing to nurses ever since they got them, and keeping them in their places. And now we have male nurses, and we're going to have a lot more male nurses. And I spoke to one group of Nursing Students Association, all women, one man, he was president. Now, for a very long time, midwifery belonged to women. It's one of the oldest specializations in human society. The oldest specializations that we know about, actually, are magical practitioners of one sort and another, shaman, mediums, curers, who could communicate with the supernatural, and midwives, which were usually women. There are some societies in which you have very skilled magical men also. But midwifery belonged to women right down through the Middle Ages, and men were always passing laws about trying to keep those midwives in order. They suspected they were witches, and there were all sorts of fears they were witches and all sorts of regulations. And then, of course, at some point in the history of medicine, it occurred to men that they might take all this over too, so they invented obstetrics and having children born in hospitals on surgical tables against the force of gravity. And obstetrics today is a male profession. Then they sort of looked and began to pay to look after children. And of course, women had always fed children and taken care of children's health under the help of the general practitioner, but everything was specializing, so men took over pediatrics. And of course, it was much more convenient to have babies on bottles, because then you could change everything over the telephone. And if a mother telephoned in and described a baby's symptom, the doctor could just say, put a little of this in or take a little of that out. But if the mother was breastfeeding, he couldn't say, please get on with your husband, and hope it would work. So it was much more satisfactory to have bottle feeding. And pediatricians and obstetricians all went in for bottle feeding. One of the very curious things today is they've now the men invented obstetrical tools that made it possible for them to see inside a woman. And women have always been a mystery. You keep reading books about the mystery of women. Nobody ever heard of the mystery of men. And of course, there's nothing mysterious about them. But everything that was happening to a woman went on inside and was relatively invisible and inaccessible. Pretty mysterious. Now they've invented perfectly good apparatus so a woman can look inside herself. And you know what that's called? That's called practicing medicine without a license. So that we have a pretty long history of specialization, and sometimes specializing, taking the things that women did as a matter of course at home, took care of the children, cooked the meals, nursed the sick, washed the dead, comforted the distraught, and listened to people talk. I think we're always talking about women as talking so much, and nobody measures the hours and hours and hours they listen to everybody else talk. But they always have. Husband comes home, he's had a hard time with the boss, and she listens. Kids come home from school and they want to talk about what happened, and she listens. Very important role, and up to about 50 years ago, discharged by women, mainly. Now it pays. You have psychiatrists. All the listening is done for money. And in psychiatry, most of the practitioners are men. You see, so every time that one of these activities that women have practiced as part of their age-long relationship to the home, every time it gets conventionalized and institutionalized, men take it over and make it into something that pays outside the home. And this is rather difficult to figure out just what we're going to do about this, how we're going to let women re-enter the occupations that were traditionally theirs, because over and over again this happens. And the most serious thing that's happened recently in the last 50 years was that we invented, 50 years, 1913, a little bit more than 50, the land-grant colleges put in home economics courses for women. And for a long time, this was a fine profession for women, and you got a lot of these great women again, you know, like female abbesses, dominating schools of home economics and looking men in the eye, and on college campuses. They were very unpopular, so the men took nutrition away from them, and nutrition is now male. And as a result of this, in the Food and Agriculture Organization, which was charged with seeing that we could feed the world, and we had all the necessary techniques to do it, 99.5% of the research goes into the food before it leaves the harvest field, with nothing done for nutrition, nothing done for food preservation, which were women's fields at home, became women's fields occupationally, and became things that men wouldn't do. The only thing the Food and Agriculture Organization does about women is to strike a medal every year in honor of the goddess Ceres. And then they finished with women for the next year. And this is very serious. The reverberations are all over the world now. There are countries in which half the food that is grown, that is then marketed so it can help starving people in some other part of the country, is destroyed, eaten by rats, molded, because nobody's been doing any work on how you preserved food in these countries, and women have been taken out of things. So that if we look at stages in human history, we'll find periods when men and women were working in a pretty good complementary relationships, both putting in separate skills and working very well together. And then periods when this gets upset and the society gets lopsided again, and then other periods when things are being restored. Now, what we're trying to do at present is to get some kind of even-handedness about occupations, trying to make every occupation available to both men and women. And we'll see whether women would do well in it or whether they wouldn't. But we've never tried it out before. You know, you hear about, well, not music. Look at music. Women they've had pianos all these years. They could play the piano, and they've never been great composers. Well, maybe women wouldn't be great composers. We don't know. Maybe the very edge of composing is a male trait, just as a lot of other traits are female traits. Maybe. But we don't know because we've never tried. And so one of the things that's happening in the world today is an attempt to open up every field to both sexes. Now, this means opening up domestic life to men. Now, men have lived an absolutely appalling life through history in terms of their wives controlling the home and sweeping and house cleaning and telling them to wipe their feet and not come in on that and sit here and eat like this and put that down and don't smoke in my room and so forth. I mean, they've been nagged out of existence virtually for thousands of years because when you give any group control over some area vis-a-vis another group, this is the kind of thing you get. And men have had stomach ulcers because women are supposed to cook and lots of them can't. So, but women were supposed to cook, so men have impatiently eaten badly cooked food until they got ulcers, when they could have cooked much better themselves. Well, now we're going to let men who are good cooks cook and not get ulcers if they want to. And try to get rid of the vocational association with sex, because it does a great deal of harm. It does other sorts of harms. For instance, we believe that, until very recently, that executives that have men under them must be men. See, we let women boss women. So we had St. Teresa talking back to popes, but she was only dealing with women. And you could have a head nurse who bossed the nurses. You could have a home economist that bossed the home economists. You could have a chief dietitian that bossed the other dietitians. You could have a buyer in a department store who bossed the other buyers. They bossed women. And they didn't get into trouble till they got into a position where they could boss men, and then they got into trouble very fast, usually. But if there were going to be an executive position where there were both men and women, then you had to have a man at the top. And we know what has happened in our school systems. That in most of our schools, the principal is there. He's principal because he's a man, not because he's the best person in the system. And that in most cases, up to through high school, women school teachers are very superior to men school teachers, because men can get much better paying jobs. So very good women teach school, and some men teach school. On the whole. Now, we tried during the Vietnam period, lots and lots of bright young men decided they liked teaching. And a lot of them liked teaching little children. And they were very good at it. And they did all sorts with little children that women don't do. But they were hounded out of the school system. We will not let men teach little children. If they want to be principals, okay. So you have this double position of not letting men do the thing that women have done traditionally, and putting a man in just because he's a man. And he knows it. And it's very demeaning. It's very demeaning to give a man a job just because he's a man, just as it's very demeaning to give a woman a job just because she's a woman, and not because she's good at it or skilled. And as a person, so our science education was almost wrecked in this country because we thought science had to be taught by men, and the only man was the basketball coach. And they are not great scientists, as a rule, but they taught physics all through this country, and the science went down and down and down before Sputnik. Then when the Russians beat us, why we decided we'd let some other men teach science in high school. But we've had over and over again this interplay between, if we put a few men in a woman's profession, then they were given the executive job. Same thing's true in social work. Executives are men, and men would go into a profession, they were interested in it. They wanted to teach, or they wanted to be caseworkers or something. They're pushed into administration almost at once, whether it's suitable or not, and women are taken out of it. Now, what we're going to try to do is to get rid of this position. Try to have every level open to women as well as to men, and see what happens. But there's going to need to be a lot of vigilance, because otherwise a profession gets profitable, and the profitable professions have always gone to men on the theory they had wives and children to support, as they usually did. And we'll probably see a tremendous amount of change in the next few years in our ideas of what women can do, and maybe women will learn how to be executives that men can bear. Now, they haven't learned yet, on the whole. And most men don't like to have a female executive over them. But I've discovered one very nice thing that works very well. You have a psychiatric hospital. Everybody's terribly overworked, and the clinic load is enormous, and people come into and the young residents, who are going to be the grown-up psychiatrists someday, there are very few of them, and then they bring in mature, wise, well-educated, well-dressed women who are old enough to be their mothers. And they train them to do a lot of the interviewing, and they don't mind. You see, they can accord them well. They've learned from life. Okay? They aren't like the girls in their class that might do better than they did and haven't had any life yet, so they can't give them credit for it. And so you get the combination of the mature, wise woman whom the upcoming young man can respect, Sometimes you get combinations of this sort, but we haven't very many yet. And so we're going to see in the next few years a good deal of uproar. We're going to see women given jobs just because of affirmative action. And the university's scared. They want to get some money from HEW and they can't get it unless they have a certain number of women in high places. So somebody takes his secretary and upgrades her to be a high executive, and then she has a nervous breakdown. And why wouldn't she, you know? So there's going to be a lot of this. There are going to be a lot of women that are pushed into jobs they aren't prepared for, because nobody wanted them to have the job, and nobody trained them to have the job, but somebody from outside has said, you've got to give some women jobs, and you better look out. And there's going to be trouble if you don't have one woman executive at this department store. And so they put something in. And very often it isn't the most able person at all. And very often people don't want to select the most able person to meet some kind of pressure about sex or race or age or something. And this is one of the things that's going to be happening in the world. Now I want to get back to the garbage. You may have noticed I didn't explain it. But the great point about, you see, the outdoors belongs to men and the indoors belongs to women. And the garbage starts indoors and goes outdoors. And this is the point of argument. When she says, you take it out, you see. And he makes a face at it. It won't. It's in. And he doesn't like the look of it. And this is probably, garbage is the thing that Americans quarrel about from morning till night. Housing projects, they all quarrel about garbage. Any place where anybody feels they're constrained, they quarrel about garbage. And of course the only answer is a grinder-up mechanism in the sink. But the trouble is that breaks down. Then you have the problem all over again. So these attempts to balance the places where men have been historically, where women have been historically, continue. And they've happened for a long time, and they'll happen again. But at present, we're now also influenced by the population explosion. And the fact that we know there are too many people in the world, we know that there's too many people for other people to take care of. There are too many children, half the population under 15 in many societies in the world. There aren't enough older people to take care of them, and there isn't enough food. And as we are the style setters for the world, and as our children use up so many more scarce resources than the children in other countries, we've got to set the style to have fewer children. We can't ask other people to do it otherwise. And this has had a tremendous difference, a tremendous effect on the whole world. It's freed, in the last 10 years, it's freed young people from the imperative that they have to marry and have to have children. I mean, 20 years ago, if a young man wanted to study medicine, and he wrote an application to a medical school and said, I do not intend to marry. I intend to devote myself to my profession. He not only wouldn't have gotten in, they'd have sent a letter back to the college psychiatrist saying they better examine him, because anybody who didn't want to get married was regarded as acutely abnormal. And they usually were, you know, because there was practically nobody unmarried at all except some pretty odd ones. So now a young man could say he doesn't intend to marry, and people don't call him names, and they don't say he must be a homosexual, or he's probably going to be a Russian spy, as they did 10 years ago. And he can even play chess without being suspected of anything. Boys don't have to have dates if they don't want to. They aren't being pushed into premature heterosexuality. Girls don't have to get married immediately. They can wait, get married when they feel like it, have children later. And so all this pressure has been taken off. And at present, it's freeing both girls and boys to make choices in life that in the 1950s nobody could make. It was just impossible for a girl to decide not to marry. And as every girl had to get married, so did every boy, because you need a boy for every girl. So all the men had to get married too, whether they wanted to or not. And we are also, of course, just probably on the verge of being able to determine the sex of a child, which will not only enormously reduce the population all over the world, but for the first time in human history, girls will be chosen just as much as boys. Instead of being, we wanted a boy, but we got you, which has been the standard position right around the world for a very long time, almost everywhere. And that will make a great deal of difference. If every girl feels that my parents decided they wanted a girl. Now, it isn't as bad in this country as it is in most places. Most people in this country like a mixed. And they may want a boy first, but then they want a girl. So it isn't quite as hard on girls here, but in Korea, where they want 4 boys before they have a girl, it would make a great deal of difference. So these are the things that are happening around the world. And they involve changes. They involve changes in what little girls think about what they may do. They involve changes in how little boys define who they are. If they go on defining who they are because they do something that they can keep women from doing, they aren't very comfortable. And so we have a considerable amount of upheaval. But on the whole, although there's a lot of talk about women's liberation breaking up marriages, I think fear of divorce breaks up marriages. And that there are a very large number of women of all ages who leave marriages today before they're left. And they think it's safer. They then may be able to get a job and they may be able to support themselves. And they're not going to wait to be deserted. And that is new on the whole. 15 years ago, they stuck it out as long as they could, and then they were deserted anyway. And probably women's liberation has given them the courage to say, I don't think this is going to last. I don't think I can trust my husband. I don't think he's committed to these children, even 5 of them. That used to be the crucial number. And so that we are having more marriages break up under contemporary conditions than we had before. But we're also having fewer people get married, and fewer very young people get married, and people spending more time thinking before they get married. And this has come very, very fast, of course. The New York Times on Valentine's Day, I don't know how many people saw that bit, with a heart and a picture of a couple in the heart. And they're getting married because they believe in marriage, and they believe they'll be faithful to each other forever. They didn't have to get married. They've been living together for 9 months. This is on the front page, or the front second page of the Times. Now, you wouldn't have gotten that 15 years ago. Glorification of people who had now really decided heroically to get married. And we're going to hear a lot of nonsense. We're going to hear a lot of talk about backlash. We're going to hear about a lot of men who are suffering and who feel their roles are being taken away from them. And we're going to hear a lot about the women who do leave and what a hard time they have. And they do have a hard time. Because on the whole, right through human history, it's taken 2 parents to bring up children. And if we want the children to turn into full human beings, they need at least 1 male and 1 female. They do better with more. You know, if they had grandparents and aunts and uncles and godparents and neighbors and all sorts of people to help. So then they have more choice of models. But they at least need 1 man and 1 woman to bring them up. And I think the children are going to continue to be brought up in families, but we're going to have fewer families and better families. And the people who aren't very good at parenthood don't have to be parents, because we don't need the children, and we don't need to force everybody in society into unwilling parenthood, as we have done in the past when we thought we were short of people. And now nobody in the whole world is short of people. Although if you're a very militaristic country or a very aggressive country, you might think you were. And this is what the sorts of problems that are going to face people in the next 25 years, with much more choice than they've had in the past. Choice is always difficult, but nevertheless, I think it's going to make a better society. There won't be so many unwanted children as there were in the 1950s, because everybody had to get married, and most people thought the best way to get their parents to support their marriage was to get pregnant. They were very moral. I mean, this had nothing to do with immorality, because they all wanted to get married. And everybody knows marriage and morality equal each other. But the way you could force your parents into letting you get married in high school was either to get pregnant or threaten to get pregnant. There were a lot of idle threats around, too. And then the parents paid for the wedding. And otherwise they didn't. And the only way you could get away from home was to get married. Get out of this home that's built for little children, where there's no place for the adolescents to have a life of their own. But now we have more choice. And it looks as if this would continue. And the family isn't dead, and the family isn't obsolete, but having so many families, having everybody under the sun living in a couple, and the whole country looking like Noah's Ark, that is obsolete, I think, and is likely to remain so for quite a while. Now, the ushers have cards for you to write your questions on. I'm asking you to write your questions so that I can answer the questions that most people ask. If you ask them from the floor, sometimes 10 people ask questions that nobody else is interested in, and then it's the end of the evening. Furthermore, if you ask them from the floor, I never know the question you would have asked. If you write them down, I can take all the cards home and find all the questions that we didn't have time to answer. And I ask you to put your name down so that then I can answer you. See, and when the question is asked, if you stand up, everybody will see you anyway. So all I ask you is to give your name, and I'll say that we'll read off the name of the person, and then I'll talk to them, and I know whether I'm talking to a man or a woman, or to a 60-year-old retired admiral. And now, if you've got any, bring up the first question. I'll take the first question as soon as you have one, and so we don't waste time. Go on, Peter, that's fine. Bring it along. Now, if you'll read, we have to share these between us.
Okay.
And you have to get over there.
All right. This first one's from upstairs.
I've told the people, I've been to see the people upstairs who are not down here, and told them they could send down questions if they want to. And there's no use there giving their names because I can't see them anyway. But people down here I want names for. Go ahead.
Okay. It says, how realistic is contractual marriage in America today?
Well, in a contract marriage, you at least talk about what you believe. You have to write a contract. If you write a contract, you discover whether you both believe in hell, for instance, which very often you have a couple marry, and then 6 months afterwards somebody mentions hell, and the husband turns to the wife and says, I don't believe in hell, do you, dear? You decide whether you're going to have children or not, and whether you want children. You decide how you feel about money and how you're going to handle money, and all of these things. And the only difference between a contract marriage and an ordinary marriage today is that you do think things over. Ordinary marriage you don't, and then you get a divorce when you find out. And a contract marriage has the advantage of one person not feeling utterly demeaned if it breaks down, whereas today most women still feel totally betrayed when they married in good faith and their marriage breaks down. Now, it has the drawback that a lot of people stay married just because they think they have to. And so introducing a contract introduces the possibility of termination. But there are very few people today who don't get married with the notion, well, if it doesn't work, we'll get a divorce. Something wrong? What? What? What are you going to do? Just.
I wanted to give you a second microphone.
But you can't do it. Okay, well, Peter and I can share this if I can find him. Where is he? Come on down and let somebody else be an usher. There are enough other people. And you stay up here and let other people pass them up to you. It's really too hard to be a chairman and an usher.
Okay, this must be from down here. And it says, how sophisticated or industrialized must our country be before roles are examined on a scale large enough to change jobs into professions? Thank you, Susan Helshow. I'm terrible on names, and I can hardly read.
Well, where is she? Find her?
Right there in the middle. See?
Yeah. Now, the difference between a job and a profession or a career, I think it's really better not to talk about jobs and professions, but talk about jobs and careers. Now, a job is something you do in order to make money to do something else. Feed your family or feed yourself, go on a vacation. You do it because it is the way you maintain yourself economically in society in general. A career is something that you really want to do, and if people didn't pay you to do it, if you had any money, you'd pay them to let you. Now, if you use that as a model, very few men have careers, and very few members of college faculties have careers. You just take a college faculty and say, how many, if somebody would give you the money that you earn, same amount, how many of you would be teaching? And you should be surprised how many people look at the floor. But the people who say, sure, I'd be teaching, I wouldn't care how much money I had, and if I had to pay the college to let me stay, I'd do it. That's a career. Now, in an ideal world, everybody would have a career. Everybody would be doing the thing they want to do most. We're not likely to attain that very soon. What we're likely to attain is fewer and fewer hours of work at a job you don't want to do, and more time free to do things that you do want to do. And that we're working towards with fewer hours of work steadily. But when you say, how industrialized do you have to be? I mean, industrialization is the thing that's produced jobs. And before we had industrialization, nobody had a job. People just did the things they expected to do in life. And in some societies they found them hard, and in some societies they found them easy. But it wasn't until you got industrialization that you went out and worked outside the home for a pay envelope.
Okay. We have a question from Helen Toscano. She asks, do more men cheat on their wives or wives on their husbands? And why does this occur so often?
Well, where is she? Yeah. I don't think we have any statistics. And I don't think we're going to get any statistics that are very reliable. One of the interesting contrasts between men and women is that men are so infernally lazy and conceited. I mean, if they cheat on their wives, they want their wives to know it. They want their wives to know that other women found them attractive, so they're always leaving lipstick around on their clothes or something. Whereas women, on the whole, quite a number of them are willing to systematically deceive. How many and how much, I don't think anybody knows. But one of the interesting things that has come out of the few statistics we have is it's the dissatisfied housewife who is the woman who's cheating on her husband. Whereas if a woman has a job that she's interested in and didn't have enough to do at home that really engrossed her, although she had to be there every night, she's less likely to be interested in running around and getting miscellaneous affairs. We've got enough material to say that's probably true at the present time.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one's from Elsie with no last name. What do you think are the good and bad points of communal living in this society? Will it flourish or die?
Where's Elsie?
Elise, I'm sorry.
Elise? Is it? What'd she say her name was? Elsie or
Elise.
Elise. Where's Elise? Did you find her? Uh-huh.
Back row.
I don't think communal living is ever going to be a general pattern. I mean, communes of any sort are a way in which you criticize society. People who feel that society isn't living up to something or other. Too much emphasis on private property, too much emphasis on material goods, something, and then you go and found an order or go and live in the desert to criticize the other people who then have to support you. Now, if you look at the history of communes and the history of religious orders, that's what they were. In the very early days of Christianity, Christians were too poor to support religious orders. So they just supported solitary hermits. And they could feed one hermit. And then, you know, they got richer, they could feed 3 hermits. And then the 3 hermits formed a commune. Now, the young people that developed so many communes in the 60s were young people that were fed up with suburban living. They were mostly upper middle class, pampered kids whose parents had done everything on the world to make them happy, they thought, who had moved out to a suburb where father had to commute for the children, where mother couldn't get any help and had to slave in the kitchen for the children, where they'd saved all their money for the children and done everything for the children, and the children found that rather empty and lonely, and they lived in suburbs where they couldn't live when they married because they were too expensive. They couldn't live there till they were president of a bank. And so they had very little relations to their communities, and they felt they had very little relations to other people. So they went out and formed communes, lots of them. And then the newspapers described them, and the movies made films of them, and they became a kind of criticism of society, and a criticism that lies back of the kind of society we want in the future. We don't want the world in the kind of suburbs we have today, where everybody's one age, one class, one ethnic group, you know, and they're boring. And what we need is the kind of communities where old people can live, whether the right-sized houses for them, where 2 sisters can live near each other when one married a rich man and one married a poor man, where friends can live near each other, and where kids can move around. There's a place for the very youngest to start life in, and as they get a little more money, they don't have to move 40 miles away. They can stay somewhere nearby, which was what we had in towns once upon a time.
Okay, this one's from Barbara Garris. How will male and female relationships change as women are freed from childbearing through contraception and abortion?
Well, you know, where are you? Yeah. This is from a man, is that right?
No, it's a
No,
woman.
a woman. Can't tell, you see, because my generation was brought up to only tell by the clothes. We never looked. I don't think they're going to, there have been many societies with childless marriages, you know. Our notion that everybody had to get married and have children is a very modern one. And in the 1920s, there were lots of childless marriages. People decided that they were interested in what they were doing. Sometimes they were doing it together. A husband and wife were riding together or traveling together or running a shop together or something, and they didn't want to be cluttered up with children. And there were plenty of marriages that didn't have children. And so that one of the things you can have is a childless marriage, which almost disappeared in the 50s. The idea was that if you didn't have children, somebody else should have an illegitimate one for you. And I calculated at one point that we needed 5 million perfectly born, magnificent, hereditary, illegitimate children for the people that had got married to anybody they liked and then the marriage wasn't fertile. And somebody else should have an illegitimate child for them. And because a marriage wasn't a marriage without children. Now we've given that up pretty much now. And so that there'll be lots of relations between men and women that if they don't think a significant thing about that we have to worry about always in a society is what you do about the children. And if you have adequate provision for the children to grow up, you don't have to worry about the other people. Now if you marry everybody off, then you have to worry about an incredible number of badly brought up children. But if you let people who aren't very good at marriage, and there are lots that aren't, and that wouldn't be very good as parents, then they can have any sort of relationship to each other. But I think we're going to move towards people living closer together, not in communes, but where there's room for unmarried people and divorced people and widows and teenagers and all sorts of people available to each other as friends and companions and somebody to talk to late at night.
Okay. It says from Stephanie Rarick, is she here? If you were given a second life, which culture would you prefer to live in and why?
Ours. I like what I did. You know, I'd like to come back. I'd love to be frozen and come back, 200 or 300 years from now and see what's going on. But at the moment, I think it's more important to stay around and try to see that something is going on.
Okay, this is signed 50 and over.
I won't have anything to do with that.
You will?
Unless it came from upstairs. How are we going to find out? Did it? Did it? Well, then I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and I hope if you're here and didn't sign your name, you'll feel guilty.
Okay, why is it a 50-year or older woman, widow, is neither a senior citizen nor a young woman? A man 50 years older is acceptable with all ages and is still considered young. Signed 50 and over.
Well, I had an English friend who went back to England. He must have been about 45 because he said he could be his age in England. He didn't have to pretend he was young. Men, after all, are capable of procreation later than women. And women have decisive breaks in their whole lives, and men don't. Now, I very often get asked by an audience, isn't it unfair that a man of 60 can go and get married again and have children, and a woman can't? Well, isn't it unfair that a postmenopausal woman is so full of zest, and lots more zest than a man has usually? A man who's discovered that he's never going to be more than the second vice president of something. He's very depressed, and there isn't a way he can get out of it except find a young wife usually. That cheers him up. But women are, after the menopause, are self-starters. And most of them, widows of 50, who really look around and see what they can do, have a lot of zest and can do a lot of things. So I think it balances out that men are not self-starters if they get into a depression about age or lack of success or being in a rut or something. Women are. But men can marry and can have children later than women, so that you have a kind of balance between the two. And a 50-year-old widow is just a young chicken today. I mean, heavens, why should anybody think she's old or senior or anything? She better get out and do something.
Okay, this is from Eric Robbins. It says, what do you think of Tiger Fox thesis?
Nothing. But a lot of people here may not know what it is. There are several men who have been working comparing people to animals, and they have the most astonishing names. And Mr. Lionel Tiger is one, and Mr. Robin Fox is the other. They work together. And it does seem an extraordinary coincidence. I mean, those were their real names they were born with, as far as I know. Now, Mr. Tiger's theory is that men have a relationship to each other, which they now call bonding, which means that they're friends and they cooperate. They learned it out hunting elephants. And women couldn't hunt elephants, so they never learned to work with each other. Poor things. And then he takes a major leap a few million years and ends up in post-World War II and says women have had the vote and they haven't done anything with it. So you see, women really have no natural tendency to work with other women in a cooperative, organized way. Well, now, if you really look at a primitive society where the men are all off hunting elephants and the women have to stay home with each other, what's harder? You know, what requires more cooperation, staying home where the men are out looking for the elephants or hunting the elephants, which is, after all, very interesting. And when we look at the way life has been organized, women have worked very closely together, only they, except in the United States and Canada and a few places like that, where we have produced the most uncooperative females that the world has ever seen. Now, it's partly because they grew up in a nuclear family, so they saw one man and one woman, and they never saw their mothers cooperate with anybody. They turned their mothers, their grandmothers into sitters, so when your mother-in-law comes in, you go out. And when the cleaning woman comes in, if you can afford to have one, you go out. So the children never saw two women cooperate for 2 minutes. You know, and each woman had her own ice box. And she didn't want anybody in it. So we have very uncooperative women in this country, and women with very low political participation in this country, and Mr. Tiger is worried about it. And he thinks it's a deep human propensity, and I think it's a situational result of the way our society has been organized.
Okay, this is from Arlene Schwartz. What are your views on abortion? Is this a moral, social, or personal issue, or all three?
Where is she? Yes. Well, I think it's all three, certainly. And I think that abortion, as handled by government in any way, that is, the state enforcing on people, either insisting on an abortion or abolishing an abortion, is an abomination. And that's both ways. See, in Eastern Europe, they turn abortions on and off like a spigot. You know, they make abortions free and everybody can have them, and then they look around after 10 years and say there are not enough people. And then they turn it off and make it illegal. So that in Romania, where they did just this, and in 1968, twice as many children were born suddenly. Now, they did something terrible to those children, because every child in 1968 will wonder if they were wanted. Every single one of them. Fortunately, they'll be male and female, and they can marry each other and console each other. And now abortion, the population is about back to where it was before in Romania, using illegal means instead of legal means. Now, we know that if women believe that a child is a person, and they may believe this at any point, they may believe at the moment of conception, they may not believe the child is a person until it leaps in the womb, till you feel life, or they may not believe a child is a person until it's born. And in some societies, children aren't really persons when they're born, because people feel they haven't made up their minds whether they're going to stay or not. So sometimes you don't name a baby for 6 months, and you keep it all covered up and don't let anybody see it or talk about it, because maybe it isn't going to stay. And there are tribes in Africa where the child comes from a spirit world and it had a spirit mother who wanted to keep it. And then it's born to a earthly mother, and the Mother wants to keep it in the spirit, mother's trying to pull it back. And so for the first weeks of life when that baby is so fragile, you don't know whether it will live or not. So the belief in when a child is a person, when it's an individual, when it's an individual that must be given all the protection that we give to life, varies all the way through, from people who believe from the moment of impregnation you're dealing with an individual. Now, we have enough studies now to know that women who believe that a child is an individual, who have an elective abortion, suffer. Because they suffer primarily because they cannot mourn. You see, if you believe that this is a child and yet you have elected to have it die, you can't mourn. If you lose a baby, if you have a miscarriage for a very wanted baby, or if you have a child who's premature and lives 3 hours, you can name that child, you can christen the child, you can register its birth, and you can weep for it. But if you elected it, that you cannot mourn, and non-mourning is very bad for human beings. So where you have people who religiously or for other reasons believe that a child is a child, at whatever point they believe this, they will suffer psychologically, spiritually, if they will its death. On the other hand, there are women who regard an abortion, well, not as nearly as serious as having a tooth pulled, or something like a vermiform appendix or something, only oftener. And if in these cases, and they've done studies of both kinds of women, they don't seem to suffer from any kind of guilt, because they do not feel that they have interfered with the life. They don't feel that the child is a life at this stage. Now, one of the curious things that has happened in the last few years is that one might think that the argument over abortion would increase our sensitivity to other human beings. And you might think that we would stop and wonder why we were pouring napalm on the children in Southeast Asia. Pouring buckets of napalm on children in another country, in somebody else's country. But that hasn't been the way it's worked. And most of the people that object to abortion are people who are actively in favor of war and capital punishment. And that is peculiar. It's very peculiar. But we do know also, you know, that there are a great many people that are very sensitive about cruelty to animals and are very cruel to human beings. And it looks to me as if the men who are so interested in abortion, and, you know, if men had to have abortions, we'd have something very different going on. The men who are concerned to prevent women from having abortions are very much like the people that are more interested in the suffering of cats than they are of people. The English founded a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals. And then some years later, they found a society for the prevention of cruelty to children. And so that at present, we are not, I think, really having the kind of ethical debate that we ought to have about the question of abortion. And the question of the rights of the unborn, I'm much more interested in the rights of the unconceived. You know, they have a lot of rights because we're wrecking the world that they would live in. And we're wrecking the world that the children of tomorrow will live in. And I think one of the things we've got to move for is advocates for the unconceived, who are saying, look, there isn't going to be any air to breathe. There isn't going to be any water to drink. There isn't going to be any soil to plant in if we go on this way. And I think that's where we're going to go, that we're going to have the whole problem of advocacy for children, including the children of tomorrow, as part of what we're doing.
Okay. This one's for upstairs. We haven't forgot you. If men have continually kept women in a secondary status by calling only men's work important, why have women accepted this throughout history?
Well, I don't think men have kept women anywhere, you know, without women's consent. There have been periods, of course. We have rapid social change. Because the men control public life, they're the people that control the change. Because public life has always belonged to men, and domestic life has belonged to women, and that made sense because that's where the children were. And as long as the children and mothers were tied together, domestic life belonged to women. And there's a third sphere, which is food production, really. And if women do a great deal in food production, they have important positions. And if they do very little, they have less of an important position. But I don't think that men are oppressors. I just think the Schoolmasters Association of Indiana, who votes that women are incapable of teaching second-year history, are oppressors. You know, and we've got lots of them. We've got lots of association of men in public who want to protect their position, and they want to protect it against everybody. Illegal immigrants, other races, women. They want to keep kids in school so they won't come up and challenge them for jobs, and they want to retire everybody early. You know. Now, this isn't men as a sex. This is a bunch of men in a profession who want to keep everybody else out. It's perfectly reasonable. So that women have, through most of history, worked within the way the society was organized, and when it got out of kilter, then you get a protest. And remember, every advance that women have ever made, you've had to have the help of men. Votes for women, women could never have gotten votes without men voting to give them this. So women have always had, when they wanted to change a relationship, you've had to convert a lot of men.
Okay, this is from Lillian. Pronounce that for me, will you?
Ruby show.
Good. Her question is aggression cultural or hormonal?
Now, where is she? Found her?
Way back there.
Way back there. Well, it depends on what you mean by aggression. If you mean by aggression assertive activity, which includes knocking people down if they get in your way, that is a vigorous pursuit of goals and a willingness to destroy or attack anybody who interferes with them. There's a fair amount of developing evidence that the more androgens, the more male hormone you have, the tougher you may be. Now, it isn't too good yet, but there's a fair suggestion that male hormones fed to either males or females, extra ones, make people more assertive and therefore more aggressive. Now, if you mean, when you're talking about aggression, is the desire to kill or destroy or maim other people, hormonal or cultural, then I think we have to say that it's cultural. That is, there's societies without war. You can bring up a whole population to be very aggressive and very violent, and in 3 generations you can turn them from being an aggressive, violent society into being a very mild, pacific society with the same genes and therefore presumably the same hormones. You can change a certain amount of behavior with diet. So if you take laboratory rats that are the same breed and have been bred for 30 or 40 generations, you feed one of them on the diet of Bengalis in India and the other on Sikhs, who are a warlike group in India. The rats that are fed the Sikhs diet get tougher and fight more than the rats that were fed the very low protein diet. So there are all sorts of things that can be modulated by culture. But we haven't any reason to believe that human beings are inherently violent, but they're always capable of violence under different conditions. One of the most striking studies that we have is a study of what happened in London in the 19th century. In the early part of the 19th century, London was more unruly and dangerous than New York City is today. You couldn't go out at night without a guard. Rich people had guards, and the place was full of thugs and muggings. Everybody went to hangings every week as a major form of amusement. was a terrible, lawless, violent, aggressive, cruel city. And then a man named Sir Roger Peel invented the British police. And he had a very simple prescription. He wanted them to behave like country squires, who were one of the few well-behaved people in England at that point. He wanted them to be patient and kind, and he figured that the bigger a man is, the more patient and kind he is, which on the whole is true, you know. They've never had to fight in their lives. You get somebody who's, as a little boy, was bigger than all the others, and he can just say, boo. And he picked only men over 6 feet, and it's interesting, in the first half of the 19th century, being 6 feet was being a giant. Big, tall, patient men who said, boo. And he didn't arm them, which was another part of the whole picture. And they came from everywhere. They were picked entirely for personality. Tinkers, tailors, soldiers, sailors. They picked out this collection of big, tall, patient men, gave them nothing but a bit of a stick, you know, and a big helmet, and they walked around and said, behaved. And London became the most peaceful city and orderly city in Europe within 20 years. So you can't claim that aggressive behavior is innate, because it couldn't possibly change that fast. I've seen the New York police behave like angels one week and like devils the next. You know, when we were having demonstrations, we had a big peace demonstration at the United Nations, and the police had prepared for it. They knew what was happening. They knew how to handle it. They kept all the exits open, and when any anti-pacifists came along, they whisked them off the scene fast, so there was no violence. 3 weeks later, they had a demonstration they weren't prepared for, and they were very aggressive. Same police. All you had to do was to change the situation. So that we can't attribute this kind of behavior to genes or to hormones, because they're the same people who will behave differently under a different situation.
Okay.
Yep.
This is from Laszlo Marcus. How would you describe the changes in our national character?
Well, I'm not sure we have any. Now, this is... What? Changes? Yeah, what? What? What?
Question reads, how would you describe the changes in our national character?
Yeah, now this is, I think I understood it. Now, where's my questioner? I know him. Where is he? There he is now, I think. Now, I'm not sure, you know, whether our national character has changed or not. Most of the time when we think there's a change, we go back and look earlier and we find there isn't. You go back and read de Tocqueville, and it's a pretty good description of America today. And if you think we've gotten more corrupt, you should read Martin Chuzzlewit by Dickens. When people were selling fake real estate, horrible swamps full of mosquitoes, just the way they've been doing recently. And so you can't, and I thought at one point that there was a change in young people saying, is it necessary or is it right? And I thought the parents were saying, is it right or wrong? And the kids were saying, is it necessary? Then I went back and read a novel of William Dean Howells, where it says, with that strange contrast between youth and age, where the age says, is it right? And youth says, is it necessary? You know, so that whether we have changed very much is not at all sure. Now, nobody has done any very intensive studies, such as we did around World War II, on things that matter very much. We don't know, for instance, whether the generosity of Americans in World War I, where they were willing to give up tremendous amounts of food so we could feed Europe, is still here or not. Now, I'm inclined to think it is. That with the same kind of leadership and the same kind of understanding, I think Americans would be willing to do just what they did in World War I, because we're in just the same situation today. Money is not enough because there just isn't enough food in the world. Now, in World War I, if we ate up the sugar and the butter, we had nothing to send abroad. So we gave up the sugar and we gave up the butter, and we used the most terrible flours and sent the wheat flour to Europe, where people were starving. I think we'd do it again. But I'm not sure The proportions of ancestry in this country have changed very markedly over a period of 50 years. And each class is made up of a different groups of people than what they were made up of 50 years ago. 50 years ago, when we passed our immigration laws, we passed them against Mediterranean people because they were never going to adjust to this culture. No, they didn't have the right shaped heads. And if you read the discussions about that immigration law in the 20s that discriminated against Italians, and principally against Italians, because that were the most Mediterranean people that we had, you'll find every argument that is used today against any one of the major races. Every one. They never were going to learn this culture. And they never were going to do well in school. And it was only 30 years later that New York City had a choice between 3 mayoralty candidates, all Italian. And in our recent difficulties over Watergate, it's been 2 Italians who carried the American standards forward, Judge Sirica and Rodino. And in 1920, we said they just never, never, never were going to get through high school. So now we have a lot more Italians today in the ruling group than we had in 1920. In 1906, my family moved to Hamilton, New Jersey, so my mother could study the first generation of Italian immigrants in this country. She made the first study. This little town in Hamilton, where everybody who lived was very poor. They'd been peasants, and they came over here barefooted. The last time I went near that town, I was told there's 7 Italian millionaires in town. They're rather quiet about it, but they're there. Now, so you don't know, and the proportion of old Americans is getting smaller every day. By old Americans mean that your whole 8 great-grandparents were born in this country, so you've lost track. You don't know who your ancestors were. You can't find any cousins in Europe. And a savings bank may offer to give you a genealogy in return for starting an account, but it isn't worth very much. That's an old American. Now, I'm one. Now, there are fewer and fewer old Americans proportionately, and they die a pauper's death. They're the best material we have for medical autopsies because there are no relatives to claim them. People have moved up from the South. 50 years ago, the major part of the black community was in the South, in a caste society, instead of in the North with a class society. This has shifted. The Appalachians have always come out of Appalachian, become prominent, and then they forget they were Appalachians. But there's a great shift also in the movement from people from the Kentucky, Tennessee mountains to Detroit. So things have changed, and we don't know for certain whether our national character has changed or not. I'm inclined to think it hasn't, but I can't answer with any certainty because we haven't been doing that kind of research, because that kind of research is done when the government wants to do something useful. And it hasn't been troubled by that kind of ambition lately.
Okay. This question's from upstairs. It says, do you think that a single parent can raise a well-adjusted child?
Well, if you remember that all the really good characters in our history were raised by widowed mothers, there was nothing as good for you as a poor widowed mother, and then being a newsboy. Harvard still has scholarships for boys who were newsboys. They aren't taken up very often today because you're more likely to be kept in bed by your pediatrician while your father delivers the newspapers. But one of the models of our society was the son of a widowed mother. And he was the one who developed character, and he worked hard, and he cared for his widowed mother. So we certainly can't say that having a single parent is bad for people necessarily. But the son of a widowed mother lived in a community where there were a lot of other people who helped. And that widowed mother was helped by her brothers, by her sister's husbands, by other men in the community. Now today we have no one to help that widowed mother, and we have no one to help the single parent. And they're left all alone to take care of their children. And I don't believe that it's very easy. I think a single parent can raise a child with the help of a community, but not alone. I don't think very many parents can raise their children very well without the help of a community. But that is the real problem. Now, when you talk about single parents adopting children, if the child it will not have a home otherwise, I don't see any reason why single parents shouldn't be allowed to adopt them. As we think that a pair of parents are the best for a child, then your most adoptable children should go to the pairs of parents. But all children who are beyond easy adoption, because of the wrong race or somebody can't find their mother so that they sign them away, so they're not really adoptable, there's no reason in the world why single parents shouldn't be allowed to adopt them. It'll be harder, and I'm inclined to think that it's better to adopt a child and be its aunt for a woman than to be pretended to be its mother. Because a single mother, you know, a single mother with no man around is a biological anomaly. But an aunt, there have been aunts right through history who've brought up their nephews and done it very well, and uncles, you see. So I'm inclined to think that single parents, I mean, if you're stuck with being a single parent because you're a widower or a divorcee, well, that's that. The other parent was there, you know, and you can still talk about them and they still exist in the child's mind. But for adoption, I think aunts and uncles are a better model.
Okay. This is from Pamela Early. It says, is there more talk of violence and killing among young children, and how can we deter this?
We're not perfectly certain whether there is more or whether it's just being more discussed and reported. That is always one of our problems. And if you go back into history 200 years ago, you'll find tremendous abuse of children, abandonment of children, all sorts of terrible things were done to children then as they are now. It's become fashionable now that we have a topic called child abuse. And we even have Child Abusers Anonymous now. And people who have been child abusers join groups to help each other, which highlights the fact that they were not people who wanted to be child abusers, but they were people that were driven frantic. Now we know with animals, if a mother pig is being delivered of a litter, and you suddenly go in and shoot a light on or have a horrible noise or something, she'll turn and eat her litter. That is, that you can turn parents against their offspring under conditions that are unbearable. And we know that there are millions of parents in this country today who are bringing children up under unbearable conditions, totally unbearable conditions. They get beyond them, so they're frantic, they don't know what to do. And one of the things they do then is to beat the child or starve it or something of the sort. But most child abusers are people who are frantic and not people who really want to hurt the children. They're frantic just the way that animal is frantic. And what we have to worry about is the state of society that cares so little for what happens to its children and what happens to its people, that we let all these things happen. I mean, when you consider that we have 3 million doorstep children in this country. Now, doorstep children are teenagers where you can't find any responsible person who could sign a medical release for them to have their tonsils out. That means they're living a life just drifting around, sleeping somewhere, no one responsible for. That's more people than we had in the United States when we became a nation. 3 million of them. Now, these doorstep children are also children who would have been abused or have been abused, who've run away from home, who've been lost somewhere. But there's a tendency, of course, to turn on the parents and be punitive. If we can just punish somebody else for something, then we feel very pleased. But what the parents need is help. And one of the things we found is a child who we brought in the hospital for some disease that it turns out not to have very often, that may have a suggested look as if it had been given too hard a beating or something. And the doctors don't do anything. The next time that child comes in, it has a broken bone. Now the mother or the father brought that child in for help, saying, help me, this is getting beyond me. I'm in a situation I can't control. And, you know, they made a study in Bergen County a few years ago of postpartum psychoses in women, and which is a rather common thing for a woman to have a brief psychotic episode after childbirth. And one of the things they say then is they're going to kill their children. A woman will run out in the backyard and take every knife in the house and go out and put them in the backyard, and then run to the police and say that she's afraid she'll kill her child. And they found this was definitely related to how far away you were from any female friends or relatives. And the further away a woman was, and the more isolated she was, the more likely she was to go into a desperate state after the birth of her first baby particularly. So the child abuse is increasing because of the state of society and because we're not giving people the support they need.
Okay. This is from Joanna Beck. It seems as though our society values the young and healthy and with little regard to the old and sick. Do you fear mercy killing?
Well, to begin with, I don't think, where is she, by the way, my questioner? Anybody find her?
Right here. Last row in the middle.
Yes. I don't think we do value the young anymore. That's a myth. We're a country at present where when a rich old lady sees 3 teenagers, she thinks they're going to murder her. Where we have people in motor cars that when they saw long-haired boys, turned the car at them. The amount of hostility that we have towards young people today is enormous. So I don't think we value youthfulness, but I don't think we care very much for our young people. Anything like the way we used to. We used to think of ourselves as a child-centered society. I don't think it's true anymore. But that wasn't the major point that you were making. No, I don't approve of mercy killing ever under any circumstances, but I approve of people having a right to decide how to end their own lives. And I do not approve of mercy keeping alive, which is what we do now. You see, we have the means to keep people alive as human vegetables for 20 years, sometimes longer. And the medical profession has to obey its oath to protect life under all circumstances. The minute we let that go, and we love to, we're always trying to get the doctors to give somebody a pill if they have cancer. And we have to leave doctors absolutely devoted to life. I've worked in societies where the same people kill and cure. And it's not very funny. And the great invention of the Hippocratic Oath was that a doctor cured under all circumstances and never took life. So taking life, if people want to end their lives and want to decide that they don't want to be kept alive as a vegetable, then it's up to them, which it legally is now. I mean, you can legally make a will, just as you can make a will and decide what's to be done with your property, and saying being of sound mind, and that's what you always have to put in the front of the will, and getting witnesses. You can say that you do not wish to be kept alive by artificial means after your brain is gone. You don't want blood transfusions. You don't want to be artificially fed. All of these things. One can do this. And this is the sort of thing I think we're going to have to move towards, that people will make a will, and they better make it when they're young and healthy, because that's the time when you really dread illness. When you get old and ill, you haven't got the strength of mind, and people cling to life who would have rejected it when they were younger. So you want to make the will a long way off when you're young and have just been looking at your grandmother who hasn't known anybody for 10 years. That's a very good time to make it. And you consider you don't want to live and be taking up space and hospitals and nursing time and using up all the money that could have sent the kids to college. Lying there as an inert, helpless person. And you can do this. And I think this is what will happen. And that people, now at present, you can stop doctors from keeping you alive. But you have no way of getting a way of dying comfortably and painlessly to other people. That's the problem that the euthanasia people are working upon when they talk about death with dignity. They want some way in which you can be given a pill, and so you will die quietly and undistorted, and you can pick where you'll die if you have an incurable disease, or know that your mind is deteriorating or something of the sort. And I think this is where we're moving. But at present, we only have the legal means of stopping people from keeping us alive when we don't want to be kept alive. We don't have the other position. But any society can take it on itself to kill its old people. Where you had euthanasia as a state operation, I think we'd have Nazi Germany all over again.
Okay, this is from Michael Cahill. It says, I heard that you believe in two people living together before marriage. If this is so, then why? And for what length of time, or until what happens?
Where is Mr. Cahill? Is this a Mr. Cahill? Where is he?
Way up back here.
What I believe in is that we should not have the same kinds of observances for people who don't intend to have children than for people who do. At present, we take two kids, 16 and 18, and they get married with all the paraphernalia of lifelong promises and whatnot, and endowing each other with property of responsible adults. And we take an old man of 90 marrying an old lady of 88. They have to promise everything as if they were young people. Now, I have never advocated people living together if they weren't married. I've advocated an individual marriage in which was legal and respectable and religious in case people had any religion, but did not involve having children. And a second, more binding ceremony when they decide to have children. And that's what I advocated. Now, a lot of people call that living together unmarried, because the only kind of marriage they know is the kind that has been applied to everybody from 16 to 90. Now, the kids have not done this. The kids have decided they'd rather say they're not married. But so they live together with their parents supporting them. And they tell everybody. They shout the fact from the mountaintops. And at any other period, we'd call that a common law marriage. And you could have been sued for support if you'd lived under these conditions. But they want to say this isn't marriage. And they want to say this isn't marriage so they can get married later. They want to save that marriage as an ace up their sleeve. For they really will get married and get him. This is mainly girls, of course. And so that and another reason why we have arrangements today is IRS. If you have in your household young children between the ages of 18 and 22, you can claim full support for them if they're not married. They can be living in sin that's up to their ears. And IRS doesn't care, but if they're married, you cannot claim support. Now, this is a definite legal backing up in this society of arrangements of kids who are students not getting married. And it's a very peculiar, just as we've been wrecking the home with our housing arrangements, because a woman with no husband gets a preference for good housing over a woman who has a husband. And she gets aid to dependent children, but if she's got a poor husband, she can't get anything. So men say, well, you're better off without me. And she is. And so we've wrecked thousands and thousands and thousands of marriage with our housing and welfare arrangements. And we're doing the same thing with our, that is, we're pushing people towards not marrying and not taking responsibility by this kind of internal revenue arrangements.
Okay, that'll be it. It's like, I'm getting this. I'd like to have you join me in thanking Dr. Mead. It's been a pleasure for me, and I think a pleasure for everyone here.